afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this program, Comics Journalism, with Dr. Kate Kelp-Stebbins. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the Community Relations team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is comics. You can find more free library programming on our event calendar at deschuteslibrary.org/calendar, or find recordings of programs like this one on our YouTube channel. Our presenter is Kate Kelp-Stebbins. She's Assistant Professor of English and Associate Director of Comics and Cartoon Studies at the University of Oregon. Her work examines comics and visual media as tools for rethinking world literature and remapping transnational media flows. She received her PhD in Comparative Literature from UC Santa Barbara. Thank you so much, Kate, for telling us about this provocative form of nonfiction comics art and reportage.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Laurel and everyone at the Deschutes Public Library programs. I want to thank everyone who's watching this. I would also just like to begin by acknowledging that where I am speaking to you from is Kalapuya Ilahi, the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Kalapuya people. So before I get started, I'd just like to say that as a professor in comic studies, I'll go ahead and play for my first slide. Talking about No Comics and this amazing series, there were a number of topics that I considered speaking about today. And the reason I went with comics journalism is really because of the beguiling urgency of our current moment. And there's a few things that I think we can agree by the end of this talk. Comics journalism gives us a sort of toolkit in order to approach. Now, I don't know if you've heard or if you're aware, but we're actually in the middle of a pandemic of misinformation. And this is something that I think comics journalism can actually help us in order to think through and to understand in terms of the contours and the ideas going on in how we get our news and how we understand the world and the people and the places around us. Similarly, very recently, there was a decision made by the McMinn County School Board in Tennessee regarding a specific work of graphic nonfiction. The McMinn County School Board determined that they would ban Art Spiegelman's Holocaust narrative, Mouse, from its school curriculum. Now, Mouse, as a form of graphic nonfiction, really clearly revealed the possibility for comics to uniquely explore the horrors of history and the mysteries of the self. And it really paved the way for a lot of other graphic nonfiction, especially graphic memoirs. So it's possible that you've heard of works like Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis or Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. Alongside these celebrated nonfiction comics memoirs, over the last 2 decades, another genre of graphic nonfiction, comics journalism, has developed into an essential field of comics art. And there are some distinctions between comics journalism and graphic memoir, but at its most basic level, comics journalism is documentary reporting produced in the comics medium. It also, however, implies an ethic of reporting that runs counter to the dehumanizing logics that increasingly determine the production and consumption of news. University of Oregon alum Joe Sacko, who received his BA in journalism right here in Eugene in 1981, effectively founded contemporary comics journalism through his graphic reportage, beginning with his series Palestine in the early 90s, moving on to his work covering the Bosnian War in Sefer Garajda, The Fixer, and other works, and then most recently in his long-form piece, Paying the Land, which explores the lifeways of the Dene people. Sacko's journalistic art entails both meticulous dedication to the visual components of testimony and documentation, as well as an ethical imperative. And Sacko says of comics journalism, quote, "I mean to signal to the reader that journalism is a process with seams and imperfections practiced by a human being." For Sacko and for its other practitioners, comics journalism presents the opportunity to escape the confines of traditional journalism, repudiating the ever-increasing rapidity of the 24-hour news cycle and the valorization of objectivity. journalists who use comics and graphic narratives to document current events and human rights struggles insist that accurate witnessing takes time. By the time they reach you, many of these stories are no longer new, but the way they reach you is. Now, quickly to trace the genesis of comics journalism, we could go all the way back to Trajan's column, because of course here we have a narrative report. This is a story being told to us in sequential images of what has just happened. These are recent events that have been carved in stone in order to relate to you things that are going on in the world. But to find more direct precedence with the material substrate of paper and with a clearer relationship to witnessing, we can look to Jacques Callot and his series Les Crimes Misères et les Malheurs de la Guerre. Published in 1633, Callot developed innovations in printmaking, especially using copper plates, in order to produce 18 loosely narrative prints documenting the influx of the 30 Years' War in La Reine. Inspired by Callot, Francisco de Goya drew the 82 prints that comprise his famous Los Desastres de la Guerra, drawn from the events in the Napoleonic War in Spain between 1810 and 1820. So these artists were already back in the 17th and 19th century using image and text together in order to create a new paradigm of witnessing, one in which the hand of the artist is inextricable from the report. And here in Goya's prints, you can see through this particular caption, no se puede mirar, one cannot look, this tension between the image and the text, and this injunction to the reader. Who is it who cannot look? Is it those who are facing their own death? Is it us who, in seeing their death, must look? What are the words actually telling us, and how do they work in reciprocal ways with the images themselves? Similarly, Goya took the time to insert himself as the artist and as the witness by adding captions to some of these, like, yo lo vi, I saw this, showing that Goya himself was there to witness what is happening in the image he drew. Y esto también, and I saw this too. So there's a way in which the lineage of comics journalism clearly roots back to these earlier forms of drawing what's going on. Beginning in 1842, illustrated reporting began to develop first in the Illustrated London News and then in a number of other publications. Now, at the same time, many of these documentary illustrated newspapers were being paralleled by the growth of humor magazines like Punch, Puck, and Judge. And it is in these latter publications that we see the development of editorial cartooning, which many historians cite as the direct antecedent to modern day comics. So however antithetical it might seem to imagine comics as journalism, even in the 19th century, we have the same material substrate and similar distribution networks being used to develop both the news and comics. And in fact, Thomas Nast, who's one of the best known US editorial cartoonists, was also a news illustrator. So you have people working in both modes at the same time. Just as one can trace the early development of comics to the developing infrastructure of newspapers, one can also see the way in which comics journalism reflects changes in the purpose of journalism itself. In particular, contemporary comics journalism is a byproduct of what became known in the mid-20th century as new journalism, which was defined by Tom Wolfe as the appropriation of literary techniques and motifs by nonfiction writers, with a particular focus on subjective, detailed, and emotion-rich long-form reporting, balanced by a common concern with social realism. Joe Sacko himself cites Michael Herr's work of new journalism, Dispatches, as a primary inspiration for his own techniques of immersive reporting. Formerly trained as a journalist and a reporter by trade, Sacko developed comics journalism out of and in tension with the cultural expectations of journalism in the 20th century. in the interceding years, his innovation has been so effective that countless artists have since followed in his footsteps and expanded upon Sacko's methods for graphic reporting. And so here you see the way that Joe Sacko tends to use the Bristol board and an ink pen in order to document his own work as a reporter. Now, these are slightly more recent works from Victoria Lamasco, who's a Russian artist, and she uses live drawing to do graphic reportage of anti-Putin protests in Moscow and Belarus, and in various other places. So she's there drawing these things as they occur and then later publishing them. On the other hand, another great example would be Jesus Cosio's work down in Peru. He's a Peruvian artist and works alongside other investigative journalists in order to document the devastation to the Tambo River Valley by projects like the Tia Maria mining project. And he goes in and talks to farmers as well as guards and other people working in the region, and then creates an interactive platform, which you can see here, so that you as a reader can go in and in fact act as the reporter, interviewing people, gathering information, understanding the place, going through maps, shuffling through different facts and different findings along the way. So in fact, there is so much comics journalism currently in existence that I was able to curate an entire exhibition dedicated to comics journalism, which debuted last fall at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art in Eugene and is now traveling to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Museum in Ohio. And that link right there will take you to the webpage where there is still an entire immersive 3D tour of the comics journalism exhibition that I was able to curate. So in the context of this burgeoning field, I want to highlight both the drawbacks and the benefits of comics journalism. Of course, we have to begin with the fact that comics journalism is very, very slow. Joe Sacko refers to his work as slow journalism, and he spent over 3 years alone working on his reportage from the Bosnian War in safe area Gorazda. He will often revisit places again and again in order to try and get the scene right. And it takes him between 3 and 5 years to do any one of his graphic journalism pieces. So obviously in an age when we are so used to immediate updates and footage on our wrist or in our pocket, comics in no way correspond to what Howard Rosenberg and Charles S. Feldman describe as the need to speed of the 24-hour news cycle. Although, to cite an aphorism, it is possible that haste makes waste. In their critique, No Time to Think, Rosenberg and Feldman point to a number of different errors committed by journalists working on this need to speed model. As former CNN executive vice president of news gathering Keith McAllister stated, quote, "It is absolutely true, and everyone who thinks otherwise is slinging BS, that every mistake that's made in the news business is made because of speed." The 24-hour news cycle also feeds on a particular model of reading and engagement by those who engage with the 24-hour news cycle. This idea of information gathering via algorithm privileges clicks and momentary attention over human engagement and deep care. Unlike an algorithm calculating likes, a comics journalist is necessarily imprinting their own subjectivity and even their physical body onto every panel of a report. In this way, comics journalism is in direct opposition to much of what is currently taught at places like the UO Journalism School. Although objectivity was dropped from the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics in 1996, the majority of introductory journalism textbooks still present objectivity as a central component of reporting and explain it in similar terms. So this is taken from one such textbook, which claims that journalists must prioritize detachment, they must follow the ethic of nonpartisanship, And they should also follow the inverted pyramid, giving readers only the most important facts first. Recognizing that the hands that draw the news are not separate from the news, comics journalism, on the other hand, leans directly into the point of view of the practitioner and the reporter. And so this is an example taken from comics journalist Ben Passmore, who was himself detained and held in a jail in Stone Mountain, Georgia, when he was there as part of a protest to protest the KKK who had gathered in Georgia. And so he writes this documentary piece documenting what happened, but it's from the perspective of his own incarceration. So every panel of comics journalism reflects the hand and the eye of the artist who crafted it. Now, a third drawback is simply what we think about comics, which is hopefully a guiding thread throughout this series. But this is a medium that has suffered quite a great deal through history. Even the name of the medium, which arose from its association with newsprint and short, funny political cartoons, contributes to what The Economist calls, quote, the naming problem of comics. It's easy to expect something to be funny when it has the word comics in it. That can make sources unfamiliar with the medium resistant to being interviewed about serious issues. How do you get someone to talk about genocide or prisoner abuse if you say you're making comics? And in fact, Ben Passmore has related a story in which he was working to try and tell the tale of someone on death row and had worked with the family a lot, and at some point showed them his own work, at which point they responded and said, "Is this a joke to you?" And ceased all relations with him because there's this sense that comics aren't serious. And I think artists like Gerardo Alba, who's a really incredible Mexican comics journalist, also show us the kind of subversive way that you can use that lack of seriousness. Alba has this style that's very cartoony and reminiscent of things like Peanuts comics or Calvin and Hobbes, and yet he uses it in a way to tell these very serious stories of US-Mexico border relations. So comics are, in the US, there's this very fraught history and a way in which the medium itself has been denigrated for a long time, first through the court of popular opinion. And we see in 1949 and before, there was a lot of comics burnings that took place throughout the country. And then through the court of the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, which were kind of under the umbrella of the McCarthy hearings that took place in the early and mid 50s. So the cultural maligning of the medium has affected its contents. Following the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, in which comics were themselves put on trial, the Comics Code Authority was established in 1954 to dictate precisely what comics could and could not show. And here are only some of the thrilling examples, but just imagine how hard it would have been in the 60s or 70s to document anything happening in Vietnam or Watergate with the requirement that policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority, or in every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal be punished for his misdeeds. So by ensuring that all comics be suitable for children, the Comics Code Authority also ensured that all mainstream comics were suitable for only children. And so it's not surprising that, especially in this country, there is still a number of people who are skeptical about the efficacy of comics to tell a serious story in a way that is appropriate to the subject. And I think we saw some of that in the McMinn County School Board Committee hearings, where people were talking about, is this, if we're talking about the Holocaust, why would we do it in comics form? But with that in mind, I would like to consider all of the benefits of comics journalism. So, first of all, this might look familiar, but if we look at Sacko's work, you will see that every single page has a date, indicating the lengthy amount of time it took him to draw every image in his graphic reportage. He makes a point to return to his subjects over and over and ensure that his first impressions are accurate rather than circumstantial. And importantly, I want to stress the benefit of this slowness from a cost analysis. Comics journalists do not make much money. This is not a hot field to get into, and I don't want to discourage anyone who might have been inspired by this talk, but the work is generally painstaking and time-consuming. If you look at the time Sacko spends drawing every crosshatch, every grain of sand on a beach, you will see a form of love. Drawing a work of comics journalism is an investment that requires a journalist's belief in the importance as well as the truth behind their account. What it may lack in speed is precisely its point. In a medium in which artists painstakingly report through drawn and handwritten means, comics creates a condition of possibility for the news, which is, in the words of Ben Passmore, the closest thing to looking through someone else's eyes, which of course leads us back to the lack of objectivity. Eschewing the impossible view from nowhere offered by objective reporting, comics journalism is a grounded practice oriented by human rights. The images that comics journalists draw are always views from somewhere, created by the hand and eyes of someone who cared about the place and its people. Sarah Merck, another Portland-based comics journalist, whose work includes Guantanamo Voices, which is her recent book collecting a number of interviews with prisoners, soldiers, attorneys, and human rights workers at Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, explicitly aligns objectivity, or the idea of objectivity, with white supremacy. And Sarah Merck says it's the idea of objectivity that there is only one story to tell, and it's mine, a white guy who's 55 years old. She instead insists that what's much more important as a journalist, quote, is to be clear about who you are. Try and understand your own biases and be clear about your identity. Investigative journalist and Syrian-Canadian artist and collaborator Yazan Al-Sadi, whose work is here in collaboration with Lebanese artist Omar Khoury, has gone further to repudiate the obscurantist power of objectivity, declaring, quote, "I'm not objective, and I don't think I should be objective. There is this constant philosophical discussion, especially in the American educational system, about the primacy of objectivity. But objectivity is a privilege, and it is the position of power. It is very easy to be objective when you're not being affected. And I think objectivity allows for a lot of problems. I'm not diplomatic in terms of the wrongs I see." And this is another piece by Al-Sadi when he collaborated with the artist Tracy Chawan. And you can see that Chawan here draws Al-Sadi actually doing the reporting and doing the research for this piece that's all about the predation of Syrian refugees by scammers in Lebanon. And so you also have Al-Sadi here drawn into the frame, hearing this story from a Syrian refugee of how everything has been taken from her by a scammer. And you also have his slightly foul-mouthed response to that. As Passmore recounts of his graphic report depicting the 4 times police have drawn weapons on him, quote, "Any one of those times, I could go from someone writing about someone being killed by the cops to being the story. That's not lost on me." Likewise, directly contradicting both the tenets of detachment and nonpartisanship, Joe Sacko asserts, quote, "I chiefly concern myself with those who seldom get a hearing, and I don't feel it is incumbent on me to balance their voices with the well-crafted apologetics of the powerful. For good or for ill, the comics medium is adamant, and it has forced me to make choices," end quote. By highlighting the subjective nature of all reporting, Comics journalism signals that journalists are not flies on the wall. A great number of comics journalists even include images of themselves within their accounts as an added form of accountability. These insertions give the reader direct access to the constraints and motivations of their particular telling in a way that most majority news outlets directly avoid. Sarah Glidden, whose work can be seen up here in Rolling Blackouts, has described her approach in this document that goes through talking to multiple refugees in Turkey, Syria, and Iraq about her own desire to report on the reporters. As she says, quote, ethical media consumption includes understanding how the news is reported. It's easy to let information wash over you and not think about the people who are actually shaping the story. Instead, Glidden wants to remind everyone that a lot of trust is required on behalf of readers, even with established news organizations, since data can be manipulated, context can be misconstrued, and the facts that a reporter chooses to omit or include can radically alter our perception of current events, which again leads us back to the denigration of the medium. Because comics are a frequently denigrated medium, they allow for a far more democratic and tactical approach to telling stories. Both the journalists recounting the tale and their subjects represent perspectives that are rarely represented or given access to the information streams of mainstream journalism. And here again, this is work by Victoria Lamasco documenting the court trials of protesters arrested under Putin's regime. Lamasco's sketches are the only visual document we have of this event because cameras and journalists were barred from the proceedings. Further, Dan Archer, a British comics journalist, reports that when he was going to look at refugees who were being kept in just deplorable conditions in France near Calais, that some gendarmes, some border control agents stopped him and asked him what he was doing. And he showed them a sketchbook and they laughed and said, oh, ha, 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 it's just comics. Similarly, Archer was able to draw survivors of human trafficking in Nepal as a means of documenting them without re-traumatizing them through photography, the medium by which their agency was stripped when many of them were forced into pornography. Archer stipulates that comics journalism is, quote, about giving people who don't usually have an outlet to speak the ability to have their voices heard. Often those who are most marginalized, be they trafficking survivors, undocumented immigrants, or homeless people, are the least willing to have their faces put on camera, understandably. By sketching them, I'm able to create more of a connection and show them the way that they will be presented on the page. The act of sketching helps to establish a rapport with the interviewee and often leads to a more fruitful discussion, helping both me and the subject to lower our guards and talk more openly as we watch the picture come together. Through my work, I hope to draw reader attention to subjects that they might overlook if the same stories were presented in other ways. The same goes for the devices and techniques of visual storytelling. As opposed to video or photo, comics journalists are able to give the reader a first-person perspective by putting them in their shoes on the events that they are reporting. This is especially important in the context of human trafficking, where all too often the survivors are shown as a third-person other, typically young girls with their eyes blacked out or shown through grainy night vision photography. And you can see in Archer's own comic that he gives an example of this. As he says, I wanted them to present their experience without resorting to any of those visual cliches. Comics journalism can also reveal otherwise unknown places and people. Patrick Chapat is a Lebanese-Swiss cartoonist and comics journalist who created a series for the New York Times called Inside Death Row that went where many cannot. Chapat and his wife and collaborator, Frédéric Widman, interviewed death row inmates as a form of graphic reportage. This powerful series brought the stories of so many otherwise disenfranchised and silenced men to the readers of the New York Times, the paper of record. Although Chapat and Widman characterized their work as journalism, the New York Times filed it as opinion, which you can see up here, reviving questions regarding the veracity of drawing. This discrepancy almost immediately recalls the debate over the New York Times decision to list Art Spiegelman's graphic history Mouse in 1986 on its fiction bestsellers list. That decision led Spiegelman to send a letter to the editor, which ultimately led the Times to move the book to nonfiction, but not without much debate. The ambiguity between truth and reality is ultimately the most significant way in which comics intervenes in journalism. Because while it is not real like a photograph, it is certainly true. Forcing readers to reckon with the question of how we visually access what is real and what is true, comics journalists ask us to question whether these categories are always one and the same. In our contemporary moment, when objective truth claims have been undermined, and the Columbia Journalism Review recently reported that trust in the press in the US is at its all-time lowest. What might comics offer for journalism and for reportage? How might the form of witnessing in comics journalism speak to not only a new genre of narrative art, but to a new ethic of journalism itself? Comics journalism compels us, in the words of Susan Sontag, to set aside the sympathy we extend to others beset by war and murderous politics for a reflection on how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering and may, in ways we might prefer not to imagine, be linked to their suffering, as the wealth of some may imply the destitution of others. Comics journalism doesn't ask you to sympathize and move on. It forces you to grapple with the power dynamics involved in reporting and the privilege of regarding the pain of others. From displaced persons in refugee camps to frontline workers in a pandemic, the humans who drive comics journalism are likewise rendered by the work of human hands which draw and record their stories. In the age of fake news, comics journalism reasserts the need for artists willing to risk everything to render the truths of human experience. It visually draws us to encounter so many human subjects we will never meet, and to question why. Thank you so much.
And if you have any questions for Kate, please put them in a Q&A, and I'll have her answer them. I was just putting together, as you were talking, a bibliography of these that are linked to our catalog that I will send out to all of our Zoom attendees so that you can check them out. There's some amazing pieces.
Yeah, definitely. Some of the best journalism is available at your local library, so I urge you to go.
And I also have linked the tour, the virtual tour that you can take of the exhibition Kate was talking about earlier, so that you can see for yourself.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Love giving more resources. Well, yes, it is a very powerful medium. That was one of the comments.
Yeah, one of the things that Dan Archer says, and he's actually in the middle of doing a PhD in computer science, but he looks specifically at how comics are simultaneously mobilizing different parts of our brain because we're accessing visual and verbal information streams at the same time. And so he says that it's one of the biggest things about the medium that that it's able to really grab our attention in ways that make us think, like force us to think, because we're trying to reckon with dual input systems, which I've always found to be really important. And as a comics professor, it's something I hope my students also appreciate as they're reading through all of our assigned texts.
Oh, definitely. And I think that makes it even more memorable. I mean, what I learned about the Iranian Revolution from Persepolis has stuck with me in a way that reading other articles alone never has been able to compete with, honestly. So one of the questions, thank you so much for these insights. Is there a distinction between comics and graphic novels? Thanks for that question.
Yeah, it's a really great question in that comics is more of a blanket term, and yet it has that kind of, problematic cachet of being for kids and being a childlike medium. But we really use comics to refer to any sort of image text. Graphic novel is really more of a term that originated. It's been around for a while, and in fact, the artist Will Eisner used it a lot for his own work, but it really got going when we saw bookstores start to become big business, so especially in the early 90s. And people suddenly realized that you could sell long form comics in a Barnes and Noble or in a Borders, but you had to call it something that people would respond to and want to buy there. And so graphic novel is in some ways a marketing strategy, but it's also really just a reference to the difference between something that is, a thick bound book as opposed to a floppy, which is what we used to talk about when we were talking about comics that you bought at comic book stores. Those are like $1.50, or now they're like $4.50, but at the time you would buy comics and they were very cheap, printed cheaply on glossy paper, whereas a graphic novel was usually something that was more of a collectible object, something you would invest more money and time into. And so Mouse is a great example because it was originally printed in installations in the magazine Raw. So they were very small, floppy, early parts. And then they were collected by Pantheon and published in 2 volumes. And so it was a way of taking something that was initially kind of more of a ephemeral idea and making it into something lasting that then you can teach in schools, you can house in the Deschutes library and in other library systems, and you can actually have it as something to learn from and to keep. So I would say that when it comes to comics and graphic novels, in some way it's semantics, but in other ways there are really powerful things that a graphic novel does to the comics form.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that, and that's great. Does the growth of digital artwork have much influence on the way comic journalists publish their work? Can that speed the process of reporting through comics?
100%. And it's not only the growth of digital artwork, it's the growth of digital platforms. So when Joe Sacko was first getting started in the 90s doing this kind of work, he would have to send his physical pages to his publisher, Fantagraphics, which is now in Seattle, and then they would have to print them. And so you think about the amount of time that work in and of itself is taking after he's drawn them. Whereas now you have places like the Nib, which is an online platform. I'm gesturing to Portland, which I don't is up that way for me and for you. So the Nib is a Portland-based comics journalism website, and it means that people who are out in the field or doing reports can send their digital files in and then have them electronically published on the Nib within a day. So that lag time to publication is much, much lessened. And so people can write more about reporting that they're doing in the moment. And so there's still the time of drawing, there's the time of doing accurate reporting, fact checking, but it's lessened by the ability that online comics journalism platforms have to then publish that work really quickly and send these reports. So for a lot of artists, digital reporting has become the way to do comics journalism, and there are a number of platforms out there now that do online comics journalism a lot of worldwide platforms like Drawing the Times, Symbolia was one, the Cartoon Picayune. So yeah, there's a number of different ways that digital has really helped and changed the parameters for comics journalism.
And you had mentioned how, this isn't necessarily the greatest monetary gain for these artists. How do they fund their reporting if they have to do travel and immerse themselves in the community? I know the other Russians artist, she lives in Russia, but how do they fund it? They have to go to Nepal, for instance.
Yeah, so a lot of them work the same way that a lot of freelance journalists do. They'll pitch a story to a publisher or a platform like the New York Times, or Dan Archer works a lot with National Geographic. Andy Warner, who's another artist, works a lot for the UN, doing graphic reportage for the UN itself and for KQED public broadcasting. So they'll often work directly with an outlet that will give them some sort of, per diem to go out and then do this work. Some people have to kind of, Sacko talks about eating from a can for a very long time in order to self-fund some of the work that he really wanted to do before he could sell it. And a lot of people will do other work on the side in order to fund their own comics journalism work. So someone like Tracy Chawan in Lebanon will do a lot of album covers and posters, which I think you can see in her art. She has a really fun, like punk frenetic style. And so she'll sell that and then use that money in order to pursue her own comics journalism. So it's really, it used to be much more, I think, hard scrabble, and it's not gotten that much better, but at least now places like the New York Times are aware of what comics journalism are, and so more willing to fund projects like Shaphat and Vidman's.
Well, and Seattle's community reading program, Seattle Reads, had The Best We Could Do, which is a graphic novel or comic journalism that those kinds of things really give credence to the level of nonfiction and reality that those books portray. So some of the other questions were about the classes that you offer at U of O in this Department of Comics and Cartooning. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would love to. So we were the first comic studies minor in the nation. And our comics and cartoon studies minor is a really vibrant and amazing program full of just tremendous students. One thing, in fact, I am so remiss for not having said this at the time, but I do just want to show you all of these illustrations of the artists that accompany the works are done by one of our students. And so Audra McNamee, who did these illustrations, is just an incredible example of what we do at UO with our comics and cartoon studies minor. We offer classes just across the board. There's an intro in which I go into the history as well as all of the theory of comics. There's also, right now, my colleague, Professor Ben Saunders, is teaching a class on American superheroes, in which he gets really into what superhero ideology means. At the same time, we have a lot of classes on manga. We have classes on horror comics. I'm currently teaching a class about graphic novels and cultural theory, in which we think about how works like Persepolis can tell us about what comics do in terms of teaching us about other people around the world. I teach a comics journalism class as well as a class on graphic memoirs. And gosh, I'm going to leave some things out. We teach a class about fan cultures. My colleague, Professor Matt Johnson, teaches an entire class on writing for comics. He himself is a really acclaimed comics writer who has pieces. One of his most famous texts is Incognegro, which which is a really brilliant story about passing in the South in the 1930s and 40s. So yeah, I would say that across the board, there's just a ton of different classes to be taken. We have classes on Latinx comics, classes on comics for children, classes on Jewish comics. So anything that you can imagine, there's probably a comic studies class for that.
Yeah, I was amazed that we had one, and yeah, thrilled that we have one right here in Oregon.
Yeah.
And I have a couple more questions for you from the audience. So, you showed artists from all over the world. Is there a global community of artists? Do they communicate with each other internationally? How do they do that?
Yes, I would say there absolutely is. And a lot of that is really owed to, again, the internet and the digital, because many of the artists that I know of working in Peru, like Jesus Cosio, Mexico, like Gerardo Alba, but also Augusto Mora, Russia, like Victoria Lamasco, but also places like Germany, the Congo, Didi Kasai, they all cite Joe Sacko's work with having inspired them. And so there's a way that now, having been able to access work from elsewhere, these artists can also communicate with each other. And in fact, I know Joe goes around and gives various workshops and talks in many places around the world. And then there are some online platforms like Drawing the Times, which is based out of the Netherlands, or 21, which is based in France, which collects various forms of graphic reportage from around the world. And so luckily there is more of a growing international community. Many of the artists working in Lebanon and Syria are also collaborating with people who are working in the US or Europe. So there's a lot more of comics community that I would say is international.
And there's another question. Is comic art considered a relevant category of art?
I mean, I think the question would be what makes anything a relevant category of art? When it comes to questioning whether comics art is art, that's something that's been going on from the beginning of time. But then again, that's also true for abstract expressionism. So when we think about what makes something an art form, are we really talking about what art is as a practice, or are we talking about who gets to decide and consecrate different forms of art? So I think that in the past 20 years, we've seen an influx of comics in museums. And this was especially true at first the NY MoMA High and Low show, which was very, very popular. This happened in, I think, 2007, the early odds. And they had comics in the show. And this was a big deal and people debated about it. But I think anytime you have people debating about whether or not something belongs in a museum, you've kind of already jumped the shark. Like that answers the question for you, because that's the goal of any museum, is to put something on the wall and then have people be outraged and go see it again and again and again. So I think as a category of art, what comics really give us is a way of, producing narrative that is very engaging and immediate, but that also requires forms of looking that are very different from what we see in the other plastic arts. There are currently programs around the US and in Canada devoted to comics art. So there's the White River Junction School that's entirely for getting a master's in an MFA in comics and cartooning. And there are other places that, like the California College of Arts in Oakland and San Francisco, that has an entire comics program. So I would say that the consecration at this point has already happened, to the point where if we're even having this debate, it's a signal of how successful it's become.
Someone said, your answer reminds me of the argument, what is art and what is craft?
Yeah, I think if you're asking if something's art, like, you've already answered that question, because that's what art asks you to do. In France, especially, comics are considered the ninth art. And there's, in fact, an entire realm of francophone study that's all devoted to Nunufian and thinking about comics as the ninth art. They were a little bit ahead of us because of what happened during the 50s here. But in France, there was, for a while, this very famous film journal, because film wasn't considered art either. And it was called Cahiers de Cinema, which is where people like Truffaut and Godard really got started thinking about film. And there was an immediate spin-off that was called Cahiers de Bande Dessinée, or the comics journal. And so you can see there that there's no hesitancy about what comics are. But I think it's always great for business if we're debating it here, because it's going to sell more books.
We'll end with this question here. What do you see as the future of comics, given current trends in our internet interactive society?
I mean, I think that for me, what comics can always do, and part of what comics does more effectively than any other medium, is to help break us out of forms of desensitization. I think that more and more with the internet, we get beleaguered and besieged with information and with imagery to the point where it loses its affect. It loses the possibility to compel us to feel, to compel us to really notice things, because we get so much of it all the time. Whereas comics are always different. And so, again, the things that I've tried to highlight here are the sorts of strategies and tools they have for catching our attention in different ways, for making us think differently, and for urging us to care about the world around us in ways that hopefully go beyond that desensitization. And as you're saying about Persepolis, Laura, leave a lasting impact, like leave us with these memories of the things we've seen and the impressions that they made upon us.
Well, Kit, this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you for everyone in the audience for your questions, and thank you so much for sharing with us more about comics journalism. I hope everyone gets to read a book in the next couple of weeks and look at this wonderful art form and see for yourself, is it art?
Yeah, thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.